but it sounds like a French name, so I pronounce it as in French. You would present evaluating the importance of data on alternative contact types in an epidemiological model for ASF in Switzerland. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, Antoine Champetier, it's right on. Thank you. And so are you seeing my slides correctly? Great. So yes, I'll be talking about a modeling effort that we are doing in the context of the SwineNet project. Some of you might have heard about. So this is a quick overview of the project. And even though sort of the key or core effort is around modeling, there's a lot around it that goes into preparation. Also, there's experts interviews. So it's a much broader project than what I will be talking about today. And I think even some of our partners are in the audience today, like Hartmut Lenz, I think is there. But there's a lot of people involved, and Salomedur is the main PI on this. And so the general goal is to identify factors and nodes that have high potential for disease transmission in pig production in Switzerland, and hopefully have some contribution to surveillance and control measure discussions. And so for the modeling specifically, the infrastructure that I'm building on this modeling is eventually designed to be used for both ASF and other diseases such as enzoonotic pneumonia and PIRS. But today I'll mostly be talking about ASF. And in the context of the ASF model, the goal or the purpose is mostly about early detection in domestic pigs. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is exploit the rich data sets that are available in Switzerland. They're rich, well, there are also obviously many very good data sets in Germany and France, and we've seen very good models exploit them as well. What is a bit different for us is that we have a closed system as far as pig production goes, or almost closed. And so we have an almost complete data set of everything that's happening. And so we'll see that we're trying to make choices to use that well when it's needed. We also have extensive farm and veterinary and trader data that tells us additional things about contacts that might be susceptible for transmitting the ASF. And that data is very nice. For example, trader data tells us what trucks, what the routes trucks might have taken to do the transportation of pigs, but they're not necessarily all complete in the sense that they don't cover all transports. And so we're using in parallel methods to try to extrapolate when those data sets are not complete. And so what we're trying to do is to make informed modeling choices and on the data interpretation as well. And so guided by the objective, in this case, early detection for ASF. Obviously, we're building in sensitivity analysis on the parameter values, but I think this is a topic that's come up already today in the talks and in previous ModAH presentations about trying to understand how choices about model structure or assumptions about model influence results. And so this is something we're trying to build in as well. And we're trying to find the sweet spot between building something that's very mechanistic and something that's sort of data driven, meaning reduces our mechanistic assumptions to try to exploit what the data is telling us. And this is, I think, particularly interesting or perhaps a bit newer when it comes to the network aspects. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So this is the general shape of the model. It's a compartment model where holding is a epidemiological unit, and then the different units or holdings or farms can also be slaughterhouses, are connected through some sort of network. Fortunately, the transport network modeling world is a well documented one. There's even a map for it, thanks to Brennan Hayes and Mathieu Andrew, who've done this really nice review, and it's still quite up to date. And so they've sort of mapped out what looks at domestic pigs versus wild boars, as well as in each group, sort of the methods and the framework and objectives. And so where we fall is right here in this group of paper by Tariq Alassa, who was also on the previous presentation. So he's obviously everywhere. But so those are simulation models that have a metapopulation component and try to assess the consequences of hypothetical outbreaks. So this is right where ASF works. And so just to give an overview of those models, or this small group of models, So they have this compartment model as a farm, and then connection through networks. And they have two main types of contact. So we have direct contacts through transport and what they call indirect contacts or lesser risk contacts through other forms. For example, through the movement of the trucks, the veterinary visits, and other trucks that are even less likely to be the source of transmission. They also have a spatial component. But so those both direct and indirect contact in those models, they have sort of a probabilistic component to them in the sense that they evaluate or they estimate the probability of a certain shipment happening from one farm, and then there's some sort of matching to a destination farm. And what happens there, sometimes you have to make adjustments. For example, if you want to account for the intensity of the contact through the size of the shipment, you have to do something about what the matching happens in terms of the arrival farm, for example. So should, is it a herd size that can accommodate your shipment? And so this is really powerful when you have a good representation of the mechanisms that generate those links. But obviously, the more generic your frequency approach, the further away you are from what the actual sort of network characteristic or network structure of your model might be. And so this is where we are making different assumptions because of our data and the richness of it, or the completeness actually of it, because I expect the richness is similar. And then there's a really nice component in these models for ASF specifically, which is the detection based on mortality or morbidity factors or indicators, which is essentially some tracking or some three conditions that have to be met for sort of the initial testing for ASF, so more like the formal testing to be taking place. And the results they have are quite interesting, I think. I mean, it's not always easy to have something insightful coming out of models. Sometimes you just get what you put in, which is what you expected, so it doesn't really help. But in this case, they have a nice confirmation that that existing measures are pretty good at detecting new ASF outbreaks, but that's mostly true in large farms, and then smaller farms, they recommend that maybe more should be looked into. And so this is for us sort of a role model, or at least sort of a place where we can borrow a lot. There's other methods that build in a lot more mechanistic structure. So this is actually something that was presented last time, if I remember well. And in this case, there's really a lot of structure in the way the batches are connected within a farm. And so this is a little bit of the direction where we're trying to go by enriching the in-farm models. So just as a reminder, this is what's shared to most of those compartment models where the farm is the unit. And so we have different compartments and we move through them. So the first stage is the infection, going from susceptible to latent, and this here we're borrowing directly from those Halassa papers or the DADS ASF model, which is a density-dependent mechanism from subclinical and clinical, and you can have different infectious parameters here, the mu and the fact that there's no coefficient in front of the C. So SC is the subclinical and C is clinical, and so you can have different contribution of subclinical and clinical compartment to the probability of a susceptible becoming latent. And then once you become latent, you move through the different stages at a fixed rate. In our case, we're fixing the steps. We're able to change. We built in the ability to change the duration of those stages so that we can do sensitivity analysis, but we're not having a random draw there. And so this first part essentially is exactly the same as has been done before, but where we start to distinguish ourselves a little bit, and this is driven by the data we have, is that we have a population tracking built-in. And this is because we want to account for the fact that we have pigs coming in and out of the transport, and in some types of production, for example, if you have a batch-based fattening farm, you really have a big variation in the population. And so we can track that because we have pig shipments in we have the number of pigs in the shipments, and so we can actually track that and sort of simulate or reproduce what's happening in the farm. And so this means that our direct contact is actually a direct shipping of a pigment, of a pig. It's not a contact with the probability of transmission. Is actually saying if you took a latent pig in one farm and moved it to another farm, now it's no longer in the initial farm. It might have done some infection. Well, if it was latent, it didn't. But let's say if it was subclinical, it might have done some infection there, but it's no longer there. Now it's moved to a new farm. And so we move the pigs in the compartment that they are. We also do the sampling of the transport according to the size of the shipments and the number of pigs in each compartment in the initial farms. And so this is and what's also different there is that we're not resimulating the network in the sense that we're not using a frequency approach to resimulate the links. We actually read through the data because we have 6 or 7 years or 6 years of good data. And so we're really reading, like I like to think about a barrel organ where you just read through the card and then you answer different questions. So the questions you answer is what would have happened if in November 2015 it had been an infection, which is not the same as to say on average what happens when there is an infection coming up, getting into such and such farm. And the same is true as far as the non-stochastic part of our model for indirect contacts, because we have those trader and veterinary data that are specific. We don't have to completely simulate it. Now there, because it's not a pig movement, so you don't take a sick pig and put it somewhere else, you do have a step of stochastic infection, which means you really have only 2 truly stochastic steps in our simulation model. One is the infection within a farm from susceptible to latent based on the dependence on the other, or the density of the other compartments, and then 1 in those contacts. And so as far as the tour data, which is all this transport data, we have the additional information of the tour sequence. So usually what you have in mandatory transport data is really where the pigs went. So in this case, they went from E to D, D to E, and C to E. So those are the shipment batches. But then what we have is also a sequence. And what we're and so this means that we can tease out very specific different kinds of contacts. And so, for example, the first one is a pig to pig. If you look at shipment that went from A to D, it spent some time with the shipment that went from B to E and from C to F. Well, but so it meant that it overlapped from so E. The shipment that gets to E got to spend some time with the shipment that came from A. And so you have a contact coming from A to E. And the same is true from B to D. And so those are contacts that happen that we think are probably much likely to have transmission. Then there's something that's less likely to be responsible for transmission, which is simply that pigs were in the same truck, but at different times. So we call it truck fomites in this case. That's just our classification. And you could see that it's a different pattern. And then you could say, well, that truck or the driver going through all of those farms creates of those links. And so really it just means that any sort of farm that's downstream from another one will have this contact. And so you could see that the interpretation of the transport data is very different if you start to look at what those tours means. And there's really a difference between saying there's a pig transmission that's a certain thing. If you take a sick pig from A, you get it in D, than from having those probabilistic transmissions. And so I should probably admitted it earlier that I don't have sort of very solid results to explain or to show you. What I have mostly is checks, and the checks only say things that we expect. So that's good news. It means that we're not driving off the cliff yet. But so what you'd expect is that if you start adding all those contacts, you would have essentially outbreaks that tend to be faster and end up infecting more farms. So here we're looking at prevalence farms and prevalence of ASF over time. But so we do find already interesting things like the possibility that you have farms dropping out of infection because they're not essentially getting, the infection dies out on the farm and they're not contacted, or they're not transmitting outside. And obviously that happens less often when you start to make a more intense network with those transportation secondary contact. Let me check the time. I will go quickly through this interesting thing that we run into looking in the population tracking. So really what we're doing is we're sort of trying to bridge a little bit the gap between a pure farm model to an individual model where you really track the full population dynamics by individuals. And so the reason why we looked into that was initially because we really thought that the cyclical nature, sorry, of some of the farms. So in Switzerland, we have a lot of varieties of farm, which makes it very hard to make strict or sort of strong assumptions about mechanisms, right? So we want to be as agnostic and try to exploit as much as we can from the data. But we know that there are some farms that have very cyclical nature because they have shipments in and out. And so you do want to keep track of when you would want to keep track of when the infection happens, because you have a density dependent mechanism that tells you where it's going. This is also true for the transports because you can have dilution effects. So if you're bringing 50 a new batch of susceptible pigs in a farm that has only one infected pig, that actually reduces the probability of that pig or the influence of that pig on the pigs that were already there. So you have some dilution effects there. The other reason is that we wanted to do this mortality-based detection very well. And so there, you want to know what's the base mortality rate well enough. And so how important is that density dependence? Well, again, this is a place where it goes as expected. If you overestimate your population, so here what we did is we put a initial population we knew was above the inventory that we know of. And here on the right, we do one that's less. Well, obviously, if you have overestimation of population, you tend to spread your disease faster. But so again, this is not sort of like a result, it's more like a check. And so what we're doing here to build in this population change and account for the density dependence is we're taking inventory data on January 1st every year. We're tracking what happens to the population based on the transports. And what you find is that you will have to reconcile where you get to, which is here in period 4, after you shipped pigs out, right? And in here in the green arrow, you'd end up here. And so you would know that's not where you are. And so the difference will be your net growth rate. And so the easiest way to do this systematically, as opposed to trying to build that model in a mechanistic way, is to sort of spread this growth over the year. And so then you start already reproducing your variation in population, which means that now your density dependence is a little bit corrected. Now, one interesting thing we run into doing this is that we found some very unrealistic rates of growth. And so we realized that that's a very good detector of, so the checks we're doing for growth rates are a very good detector of problematic or missing data. I'll go a little faster, but so this is just to show you this idea or this finding. So this is what a net population looks like in a production farm that's just cranking out a lot of piglets, right? So you see, shipments every time. That's the little steps down the ladder, and so you have a very nice steady growth rate, which is the net one. They might have some mortality, but you have a net output, and they're not shipping anything. So this is really a farm that produces piglet without bringing any in. So that gives you a good estimate of a growth rate or net growth rate. You could also find some cases where it's really easy to get a death rate. For example, in summer husbandry, you see that every year they bring about 25 pigs in, they fatten them over the summer, and then they pull them out, and then they go to the next step. And you could see that here, that step of 2 is they lost 2 pigs, and so you have a mortality calculation there. And so the idea is to exploit of that. There's cases that are a bit more complicated. So here we have a fattening farm, and you can see that there's an upward trend, which means they're losing pigs over time. And so you can calculate that and apply it. But then it also allows you to do things a bit more carefully, like, for example, having rates that change over time. So you could see that here, this holding has had a turn after about 3 years. They moved to a different production system or something else. And so we could have not only a farm-specific, but a time-specific mortality, which matters both for the density dependence and for the detection. And so, as I was saying, sometimes if you plot the growth rates, you will see that things could get really out of control. So the 0 ones make a lot of sense. That's if you're fattening, you're near 0, you're a bit below. But then when you get to very weird negative rates or very excessive positive rates, you know that something's going on. And so this is what happens. You see this is a fattening farm that has about 150 pigs with about three batches sort of overlaid or staggered. And here you see this jump. And so really what happens is that either a shipping was not counted or the number of pigs was not counted well. But this seems like a strange thing. It could be that the farm restructured or they changed, they build a new building or something like that. But when you see it happen a lot, then you start to worry. And so you start to have a very good idea. So why is it important to get the data really straight? Well, if that's the data that you're using in case of outbreak to do traceability back, I think it's a very good contribution to say, to be able to say there's missing data or your data is not well structured. So just in conclusion, I wanted to sort of add a very small contribution to what Colin Burt said last time, saying that modeling, the best role of models might be to help specifying scenarios. And in this case, I think two things emerged from our effort to develop this model. One is that it really forced us to look very carefully into, or defining very carefully, the type of contacts that happen that you might call indirect contacts, but actually there's a lot of detail going into there. But also, it might also give you an opportunity or reason to look at data more carefully. And so even if this data is never used in a model, for example, for traceability, you might find some interesting insights there. And I'll finish with some questions rather than comments about the methods of the modeling. And so one is about trying to bridge this gap between individual and compartment models. And so trying to see if we can sort of make both, take the best of both worlds. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do with this partial population tracking. And also there's this trade-off between the very data-driven and mechanistic features. And so I think we have this idea that we always should have, take as much data, and more data is better. But I think it's a little bit, it's not always as clear. So for example, in our case, because we're cranking this model through in the sense that we're using the punch card to read what actually occurred in terms of network, we're very specific about what the network looked like, not just in a frequency approach. So that's very good. And we can tell, it narrows down our range of predictions. However, it prevents us from doing things like predicting things either in the future or on average. And so there's this trade-off there. Now, to finish, I think one question that's sort of underlying a lot of the discussions that we have about those models is the transparency, or the ability to track all the different patches that we have, or I call them patches, but they're assumptions that we have to make to match the gap between the data and the modeling feasibility. And so I think I'm learning about it as we do, but I think it might be a good discussion to have, how we can systematically check how those ad hoc assumptions have done, because they sort of have to be done. So that's it. Thank you. And I will be happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Antoine, for these very interesting talks, and also thank you to have opened the discussion on where the models could be useful, and the interactions between models and data, and everything we can have in mind about that. And as there is for the moment no hands raised, I will start, because I found this discussion very interesting, and especially in many areas in EU, and especially when we look at livestock, we are in a data-rich context. So we have maybe not everything we would like, but we have many data, especially about demographics, transport, and sometimes also practices and so on. And I would like, well, if you can elaborate a bit about what do you think about that, and how we could make some advice for the areas where they might have less data or less precise data to use the model we developed also to address this question. So where we can use less data and aggregated data, anonymized data, or things like that. Where is it feasible and where it's really a problem because it induces very different predictions, for instance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But so I think one, I don't want to say it's a responsibility, but one opportunity we have is to actually be a little bit put the extra work to make our models, to test our models in terms of structural assumptions and not just the classic parameter sensitivity. And the way this goes into what you're saying is that because we have all the detailed data, we can actually say, well, let's say if I didn't have that data on, let's say, mortality, I have a survey and I have this additional survey on practices or on, antibiotic use or whatever. If I didn't have a broken down data that I have, but only the aggregate, how well would that change? How much would that affect the predictive ability of my model? And since we have it, I think we don't really have a strong incentive to do it as long as the reviewers don't ask us, what's going on behind that assumption. But I think we could contribute that a lot by doing that, by essentially saying we can check with and without that level of precision. So let's do it. But it's a lot of work because it means that you have to do all the coding in the sense that's flexible, where you can sort of turn on and off features of what you're doing. And so there's also something that's been brought up before, which is best coding practices, and it's always a tricky spot to be, because if you talk to software engineers, obviously they have a lot unit testing, all those sort of really good habits. But if you come from the field, you can only learn so many. And so I think there's an effort to do that has impact. Yep, good point.
Any question from the audience? The break is almost there, so if you have questions, it's right now. Well, I have a second one, so I can continue with my second question. When you talk about the recent review from Brandon about the different models for ASF, I think on the diagram you show, one of the key where something is lacking is about the considering both wildlife and livestock at the same time, and well, it's not included in what you presented, but you have a special component with 2 kilometers, and I was wondering what it was for. What do you account for with this special component of 2 kilometers, and did you intend to have a kind of indirect way to consider also the risk of transmission between herds because of indirect contacts with wildlife?
Right. No, very good point. And I wanted just to pull back the slide because I think it's very, it can hide, right? It's just this one line on top where they really did the both in there. And so I completely agree. And I think from I'm not an expert in ASF, far from it. But just, from having tried to follow a little bit what's going on, I think it's clear that you have to do both to try to be sort of realistic, or at least not miss some of the big points. And so let me just scroll down, because on this, about the 2 kilometers area, yes, some of it is to try perhaps to capture the wild boar idea. And so which is that, so initially I thought about having a full population, a wild boar, model in there. But, that's just yet another thing. So maybe we'll do it. I'm not sure. But so the 2 kilometer radius is also because as we are going to use the same infrastructure for other diseases like respiratory diseases, this is something where we want to have it and be able to, obviously not just do 2 kilometers, but just adjust to different kernels of spatial diffusion. The place where we're trying to be a little bit more careful about the wild boar interaction is in the index case. And so there's this nice little paper from some of the people in our institute, but with other co-authors, that essentially has built maps of the risk of introduction from wild boar into domestic herds. And they've looked at a lot of factors. They've done a nice job at gathering the data. They obviously use the density and the types of farm or pig holdings, pasture-based or outdoor based, but they also have a map of densities of wild boars, and also here, this map they also have on the bottom right corner is highway stops where you could have a transmission to wild boars, and then you have the local wild boar population having ASF, because that's also something we've seen happen in Eastern Europe. And so at the moment, the spatial part, the 2 kilometers is really something that's generic. So yes, it could be wild boars, but we're not really modeling any dynamic aspect. There's really, through, I guess, the media, the environment, you could have that transmission. And then the other part we're doing it okay, or trying to, is to have this risk-based index case, essentially.
Okay.
But I agree, it's not quite the same as, I'm not gonna, get the
yeah,
both.
But it's a good starting point for you, because you could have this area that could be heterogeneous in space, for instance, because where you have many wild boars, maybe it's larger. Where you have only few, it could be smaller. It can be some kind of indirect consideration of the wildlife. So
right.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, do you really start modeling the dynamics of both of the wild boar population and the disease in the population, right? And so you could do reduced form of that, where you have spatial units that have some sort of time variation. So that's one first way that wouldn't be too heavy in terms of expanding, having this whole other side. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's always tempting to put more features, but as we were discussing just before, it's also really important to check how your assumptions and how your features matter, and not just in terms of parameter values.